April 20th, 1945. It was Adolf Hitler's 56th birthday. There was no celebration. In the bunker's cramped conference room, a grim gathering took place. The usual loyalists were there: Goebbels, the fanatical propagandist; Bormann, the sinister gatekeeper; Himmler and Goering, whose power was already leaching away. They urged the Führer to leave Berlin, to flee to the Alpine redoubt in Bavaria, a mythical last stand in the mountains. For a moment, he entertained it. But something in him had broken. The tremors in his left hand were more pronounced. His posture was stooped. He was a phantom of the vibrant orator who had mesmerized a nation. He refused. Berlin would be his Thermopylae, he declared, but this was no heroic last stand of 300. This was the last act of a tyrant, determined to drag his entire nation into the abyss with him. In the days that followed, the noose tightened. The sound of artillery grew closer, more personal. It was no longer a distant rumble, but a percussive blast that shook dust from the ceiling, a constant reminder that the world above was being systematically pounded into dust. The bunker's inhabitants moved through a twilight existence. Sleep was fractured by the explosions and the shriek of the ventilation system. The air was thick with the scent of the generator's exhaust and the metallic tang of panic. And then the news came. The news that severed the last tether to reality, the last strand of hope. On April 22nd, during the Daily Situation Conference, Hitler was informed that General Steiner's promised counterattack to relieve Berlin had not only failed to materialize, it had never even been launched. The orders he had screamed into telephones, the armies he believed were marching to his rescue, were phantoms. The military machine he believed he still controlled had ground to a halt, its parts scattered, surrendered, or destroyed. What happened next was the Great Tantrum. It was a volcanic eruption of pent-up fury, shame, and shattered delusion. He screamed, he raged. He condemned the entire German army, the SS, his own officers as traitors, corrupt, unworthy of his grand design. For the first time, he openly, unequivocally admitted it was all over. The war was lost. He, Adolf Hitler, had been betrayed by everyone. In that moment, the last vestiges of the statesman, the commander, fell away, revealing the core of a wounded, narcissistic child. He declared he would remain in Berlin. He would die here. He would never allow himself to be captured, to be paraded in a cage by the Asiatic Bolsheviks. The decision was made. The final act had been set in motion. The atmosphere in the bunker shifted instantly. From a desperate military headquarters, it became a tomb in waiting. A strange, fatalistic calm descended upon some, while in others, a frantic animal terror took hold. Staff officers and secretaries who had served for years were now given permission, ordered even to leave, to try and break out through the Soviet lines. To save themselves, some went, but a hard core remained, the true believers, the doomed. Among them was Eva Braun. She had arrived in Berlin against Hitler's orders, refusing to be safe in Bavaria while he met his end. She was an incongruous presence in this hellscape. While the bunker was a study in grey and field grey, Eva brought with her the ghost of a different world. She wore elegant dresses, applied her makeup meticulously, played cheerful gramophone records, a desperate attempt to maintain a semblance of normality, of the Berghof salon life, in a concrete coffin. Her presence was a silent testament to the one human connection Hitler seemed to value, a relationship as bizarre and enclosed as the bunker itself. And then there was the Goebbels family. Joseph Goebbels and his wife, Magda, brought their 6 young children, Helga, Hilda, Helmuth, Hold, Hedda, and Hyde, down into the bunker. They were beautiful, blonde, well-mannered children, their innocence a stark, horrifying contrast to the death cult their parents were embracing. They were housed in a few small rooms, their lives now confined to this underground labyrinth, their futures already being signed away by their parents' fanaticism. Magda Goebbels, a woman torn between maternal love and a twisted ideological devotion, would later write, "The world that will come after the Führer and National Socialism is not worth living in, and for that reason I have brought the children here too." As the week wore on, the outside world continued to crumble. On April 28th, a final devastating betrayal was discovered. The BBC reported that Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, the man who embodied the regime's terror, was attempting to negotiate a separate surrender to the Western Allies through Count Foch Bernadotte. For Hitler, this was the ultimate treachery. Himmler was his loyal Heinrich, the man he trusted implicitly. The rage was cold, methodical now. Himmler was condemned to death in absentia. But the betrayal also spurred the final, macabre piece of business. If the world was ending, then at least its forms should be observed. Late on the night of April 28th, in the bunker's small map room, with the Soviet shells providing a grim wedding march, Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun were married. The ceremony was brief, bureaucratic. A Berlin municipal councillor, Walter Wagner, was fetched from a Volkssturm unit fighting nearby, still in his uniform, to perform the civil ceremony. Hitler wore his usual uniform jacket, Eva an elegant black silk dress. She signed the marriage certificate, Eva Hitler, finally achieving the legitimacy she had craved for over a decade. There was no celebration, only a somber gathering for a glass of champagne with a few intimates. The wedding party was awake. The clock was now ticking down its final revolutions. The very next day, on April 29th, the reality of their situation was hammered home with brutal force. The Soviet forces were now less than 500 meters away. They had reached the Potsdamer Platz. The Tiergarten was a fiery wasteland. The end was not days away. It was hours. It was on this day that Hitler dictated his last will and testament. The document was a masterpiece of self-justification and denial. He blamed the war entirely on international Jewry, exonerated himself of all responsibility for the catastrophe, and expelled the traitors Göring and Himmler from the party. He appointed Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz as his successor as President of the Reich and head of state. To the very end, he was orchestrating, commanding, creating a government for a country that no longer existed. And then a final, chilling act. He summoned one of his favorite dogs, a German shepherd named Blondie, to test the potency of the cyanide capsules he had received from Himmler's own SS doctor. He ordered one to be administered to the animal. Blondie died instantly. The poison was real. The method was confirmed. The stage was set. The cast was in place. The final hour was approaching. The wedding was over. The will was written. The poison was tested. All that remained was the final, terrible curtain. The morning of Monday, April 30th, 1945, did not arrive in the Führer bunker with sunlight. Down in that concrete labyrinth, 12 meters beneath the burning ruins of the Reich Chancellery Garden, day and night had blurred into a single, perpetual twilight, marked only by the electric lights and the relentless, shuddering concussions from above. There was no dawn, only a continuation of the night before, a night that had been spent in the certain knowledge that it was, for most of the inhabitants, their last. The air, stale and thick with the smells of damp, fuel and sweat, was now also laced with a new acrid scent, the smell of resolved fate. The frantic energy of the previous days, the betrayals, the wedding, the dictation of the will, had evaporated, replaced by a heavy funereal calm. The decisions had been made. The scripts had been written. Now it was only a matter of actors playing their final parts. Adolf Hitler had retired to his private quarters in the small hours after the marriage, but it is unlikely he slept. His personal adjutant, Otto Gunsch, outside the door, would have heard only the faint, shuffling movements of a man packing in a cage of his own making. The man who emerged in the morning, likely around 8:00 or 9:00 a.m., was a spectre. His uniform jacket, usually meticulously presented, was wrinkled. His face was a grey, sagging mask. The famous hypnotic stare of his blue eyes was now vacant, clouded by exhaustion and the massive doses of medications and stimulants administered by his physician, Dr. Moll. But beneath the physical collapse, there was a terrifying clarity of purpose. The hysterics of the great tantrum were gone. What remained was a cold, determined resolve to see his final order through, his own death. Across the narrow corridor, in the room she now shared with him as his wife, Eva Hitler, née Braun, was also preparing for her final performance. For her, this day was the culmination of the strange, confined life she had chosen. She had never been interested in politics or military strategy. Her world was one of personal loyalty and emotion. Her decision to come to Berlin was not an ideological stand, but a romantic one. She would not let her lover die alone. On this final morning, she was the picture of composed fatalism. Witnesses recalled her being calm, even serene. She laid out her best clothes, selecting, with care, the dress in which she would be remembered. It was a dark blue dress with white polka dots, a final, vain attempt to bring a touch of elegance and normalcy to the grotesque proceedings. She applied her makeup with the same precision she had used in the sunlit gardens of the Burghof. For Eva, this was not a political suicide. It was the final scene of a grand, tragic opera, and she was determined to play her part flawlessly. The bunker was stirring, but it was a hushed, muted activity. The military staff, Generals Krebs and Bergdorf, Adjutants Gunsch and Linge, went through the motions of the final military situation conference. The news was, of course, catastrophic. The maps were almost meaningless now. The Soviet forces of the Third Shock Army were less than a block away. They had taken the Ministry of the Interior building and were fighting in the tunnels of the U-Bahn system, their voices and gunfire now audible from the Vostrasse exit of the bunker. The report was a formality, a ritual performed one last time for a commander who no longer had any commands to give, any armies to direct. Hitler listened, but his responses were perfunctory. The fate of Berlin, of Germany, was no longer his concern. His only concern now was the method and the moment. Following the conference, a strange and macabre normality descended upon the bunker for a few hours. It was the calm at the eye of the hurricane. Hitler, in a gesture that was both surreal and deeply human, undertook the methodical process of putting his affairs in order. He began to sort through his personal papers. Documents, letters, and private files were brought out. He instructed his remaining private secretaries, Traudl Jung and Gerda Christian, to begin destroying them. The women took turns feeding sheaves of paper into a small, inadequate incinerator in the bunker's courtyard, the flames a tiny, futile counterpoint to the inferno consuming the city above. The air grew thick with the smell of burning paper, the smell of a history being deliberately erased, a legacy being consumed by fire before the enemy could claim it. But paper was not the only thing to be disposed of. Hitler then turned to his personal effects. He had a collection of photographs, mementos from his rise to power, pictures of his mother, Clara, and of his beloved niece, Jelly Rorbel. He sorted through them, selecting a few. Then he summoned his valet, Heinz Linge, and his adjutant, Otto Gunsch. He gave them specific, solemn instructions. Some of these photographs were to be saved, to be given to his successors as keepsakes. Others were to be destroyed. He was curating his own legacy, deciding which images would survive him and which would vanish into the smoke of the bunker. He also gathered a handful of personal items, a silver-framed photograph of his mother, a worn copy of Schopenhauer's works. These were not for destruction, they were talismans of a past life, to be handled one last time. During this process, he also made his final material preparations. From a locked case, he retrieved 2 items. The first was a Walther PPK 7.65 pistol. He checked the action, ensuring it was clean and loaded. This was his backup, a tool of final resort. The second item was more significant, a Walther PPK in the larger, more powerful .32 ACP caliber. This was to be his primary instrument. He handled it with a familiarity that was chilling. This was the weapon that would provide the violent release, the crack of sound that would punctuate his life. Alongside it on a table, he placed the brass and glass cyanide capsules. The one tested on his dog, Blondie, had proven lethally effective. He now had 2 capsules set aside, one for himself and one for Eva. The poison was the insurance policy, the silent, clinical partner to the pistol's violent report. Meanwhile, in the small rooms allocated to them, the Goebbels family was living through their own private hell. Magda Goebbels, the beautiful and fanatically devoted wife of the propaganda minister, was a woman torn asunder. Her maternal instincts, the deep, biological love for her 6 children, were in a final, desperate war with her ideological devotion to Hitler and National Socialism. She had written in her letter to her son from a previous marriage, Harold, "The world that will come after the Führer and National Socialism is not worth living in." She and her husband had decided that this principle extended to their children. They would not allow them to grow up in a world without the Führer, a world they viewed as monstrous and irredeemable. On this morning, Magda was putting on a brave face for the children. She helped them dress, she tried to maintain their routine, but the strain was unbearable. She would retreat to her room, weeping uncontrollably, only to emerge minutes later, her face composed, to tell the children a story or play a quiet game. The children themselves, Helga, Hilda, Helmuth, Hold, Hedda, and Hyde, aged from 12 to 4, were confused and frightened. The underground world was strange. The noises were terrifying, and the adults around them were behaving in ways they could not understand. They were the ultimate, innocent victims of a poisonous ideology, their lives already forfeit by the decision of their parents. Joseph Goebbels, for his part, was in his element. The impending doom validated his entire worldview. He saw himself and his family as the last, pure defenders of the faith, the final chapter in a heroic, tragic saga. He moved through the bunker with a grim satisfaction, constantly at Hitler's side, reinforcing the Führer's resolve, whispering his fanaticisms. He had long believed that the German people had failed the Führer, and now their total destruction was a form of cosmic justice. His own suicide and the murder of his family was the ultimate act of propaganda, a final, terrible statement to the world. Around noon, the pace began to quicken. The final rituals were about to begin. Hitler instructed his senior staff and his personal servants to be ready. He then gave one of his most chilling orders. He instructed his valet Heinz Linge that after his death, his body was to be carried upstairs immediately into the garden of the Reich Chancellery, doused in gasoline and burned. "I do not wish," he said with cold emphasis, "to be put on display in a Russian panopticon." The fear of his corpse becoming a trophy, a relic for the Bolsheviks to desecrate, was a powerful driver. Cremation was the final act of control, the ultimate disappearance. He needed to vanish from the earth as completely as his Reich was vanishing. The inhabitants of the bunker then gathered for what would be their final meal with Adolf Hitler. It was a somber, funereal affair. The food, surprisingly, was still adequate, a simple meal of spaghetti and a light sauce, prepared by the kitchen staff who continued their duties with a robotic detachment. The conversation was sparse, conducted in hushed tones. Hitler himself barely touched his food. He spoke quietly with his two secretaries, Traudl Jung and Gerda Christian, and with his dietitian, Konstanz Manzeli. He made small talk, asking them about their plans, urging them to try to break out of the city. It was a bizarre and deeply uncomfortable moment, this attempt at normal conversation in the face of imminent death. Eva Braun, sitting beside him, also ate little. She reportedly refused the food, stating she wished to be composed and not feel unwell for what was to come. She did, however, sip a little wine. Her calmness was a stark contrast to the tense, grim faces of the military men around the table. At approximately 2:30 p.m., the meal concluded. Hitler and Eva stood up. The moment had arrived. Hitler turned to his personal staff and the few remaining members of his inner circle who were gathered in the corridor. He began his final farewells. He first approached Joseph Goebbels. The two men, architect and amplifier of the Nazi nightmare, clasped hands. No words could adequately capture the moment. Their partnership, which had manipulated the soul of a nation, was ending here in a concrete whole. The farewell was brief, intense, and full of unspoken understanding. Next, he moved to Magda Goebbels. She was weeping uncontrollably now, the facade of composure utterly shattered. Hitler took her hand and spoke a few quiet words. He then bent and kissed her hand in a formal, almost archaic gesture. It was a final acknowledgement of her loyalty and a silent blessing for the horrific act she was about to commit against her own children. He then went down the line, saying goodbye to the others, Bormann, Krebs, Burgdorf, his secretaries, his adjutants. The conversations were short. He thanked them for their service. He urged them once more to try to save themselves. To his long-serving secretaries, Traudl Jung and Gerda Christian, he said, "Please try to get to the west. Give my regards to my homeland, Bavaria." His voice was low but firm. The most poignant farewell was with his dog's keeper, Sergeant Fritz Torno. Hitler instructed him to ensure that his other dogs, including Blondie's recently born puppies, were also killed. They too must not fall into enemy hands. It was a final, chilling demonstration of his ethos. What he could not control, he must destroy. Finally, he and Eva turned and walked the few steps towards the door of his private study. They paused for a moment at the threshold. Hitler looked back one last time at the small, grief-stricken group in the corridor. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Then he turned, opened the door, and stepped inside into the antechamber of his study. Eva Braun followed him, without a word, without a backward glance. The heavy, soundproofed steel door closed behind them with a soft, definitive thud. Otto Gunsch, standing guard outside, immediately took up his post, blocking the door. The orders were absolute. No one was to enter under any circumstances until a significant amount of time had passed. The final act was now behind that door. In the corridor, a dead silence fell, broken only by the muffled thunder from the world above. The clock on the wall read approximately 3:15 p.m. Inside the room, Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun were alone for the last time. He sat on a small sofa, positioned to the left of the door. She sat to his right. On a small table beside them were the Walther pistols and the 2 glass cyanide ampoules. There was no hesitation. Eva Braun Hitler picked up her cyanide capsule, crushed it between her teeth. The taste was of bitter almonds. She slumped over immediately, the poison arresting her nervous system in seconds. It was a quick, if not painless, death. Hitler watched her die. Then he picked up his Walther PPK.32. He placed the barrel against his right temple. Some accounts suggest he also bit into his cyanide capsule at the same moment. Others maintain he relied solely on the gunshot. He pulled the trigger. The sound inside the soundproofed room was muffled, but it was unmistakable, a single, sharp crack. Outside the door, Otto Gunsch and Heinz Linge waited. They checked their watches. They waited for what they deemed a sufficient interval, 10 long, agonizing minutes. At around 3:30 p.m., they exchanged a look. It was time, pushing the door open. They entered the room. The scene that greeted them was exactly as they had been told to expect. A cloud of gunpowder smoke hung in the stale air. Adolf Hitler was slumped on the sofa, leaning to his right. Blood dripped from a gaping entry wound in his right temple and poured from a larger exit wound on the left side of his head. The Walther pistol lay by his foot, where it had fallen. On the sofa beside him, Eva Braun was curled up, her legs drawn beneath her. There was no visible wound on her. Her face was contorted in a rictus of pain from the cyanide, but she was still, her polka-dot dress undisturbed except for the final, violent shudder of her death.